My friends, I want to talk to you today about something that shakes the very foundation of our lives. The power of God's plan. There are many forces at work in this world. Governments rise and fall, wealth comes and goes, technology advances at a pace we can hardly keep up with. But I ask you, is there anything more powerful than the plan God has for your life? Look around and you'll see people striving, pushing, chasing after their own plans. They think success is in their hands, that their future is something they must control. But listen to me, there is a higher calling, a greater design, a divine purpose that is far beyond human understanding. The Bible tells us that God's plan is not just good, it is perfect. His will is not just an option, it is the only way to true fulfillment. Many have tried to resist it, many have fought against it, but no man, no nation, no power in heaven or earth can stand against the will of Almighty God. Pharaoh thought he could hold back the children of Israel, but God parted the Red Sea. Jonah tried to run from God's calling, but he found himself in the belly of a great fish. Paul persecuted the church, but God turned him into one of the greatest apostles of all time. You see, when God has a plan, nothing can stand in its way. But some of you may be wondering, if God's plan is so powerful, why do I struggle? Why do I feel lost? The answer, my friends, is not that God's plan is weak, but that we often fail to surrender to it. We let doubt creep in. We let fear take hold. We let sin keep us from the path He has set before us. But listen, the moment you surrender, the moment you say, Lord, have your way in my life, that's the moment everything changes. No force on earth, no power of darkness, no scheme of man can undo what God has ordained. His plan for you is greater than your past, stronger than your failures, and more glorious than anything you can imagine. The question is not whether God's plan is powerful. The question is whether you will trust it. Will you let go of your own way and say, not my will, but yours be done? Because when you do, you will see His power at work. You will walk in His promises. You will experience the fullness of His grace. And you will know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there is nothing more powerful than God's plan for you. From the very beginning of time, God's plan has been unfolding with absolute certainty. Nothing in the universe can stop it. No force of nature, no power of man, no scheme of the enemy can stand against what God has ordained. The Bible is filled with countless examples of men and women who tried to resist God's will, yet in the end, His purpose prevailed. Think about Pharaoh in Egypt. He was the most powerful ruler of his time, commanding vast armies and resources beyond measure. When God sent Moses to demand the release of his people, Pharaoh refused. He hardened his heart. He thought his power and authority could resist the will of Almighty God. But what happened? God sent plague after plague until Pharaoh had no choice but to let the Israelites go. Even then, he pursued them, thinking he could still win. But when he sent his armies into the Red Sea, the waters closed in and swallowed them up. Pharaoh's power was great, but it was nothing compared to the unstoppable plan of God. Look at the story of Jonah. God called him to preach to the people of Nineveh, but Jonah had his own ideas. He thought he could run away from God's calling, escape his plan, and do what he wanted instead. He boarded a ship and sailed in the opposite direction. But God sent a storm so fierce that even hardened sailors knew something supernatural was at work. Jonah was thrown into the sea and swallowed by a great fish, only to be spit out 3 days later onto dry land. No matter how far he tried to run, God's plan for Jonah remained in place. He had been chosen to deliver a message, and nothing, not fear, not disobedience, not even the depths of the sea, could stop God's purpose from being fulfilled. Then there's the story of the Apostle Paul. Before he became the great preacher of the gospel, Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He was feared by believers, known for hunting them down and having them thrown into prison. He was convinced he was doing the right thing, but God had a different plan. On the road to Damascus, a blinding light stopped him in his tracks, and he heard the voice of Jesus calling him to a new life. In that moment, everything changed. The man who once tried to destroy the church became its greatest champion. He spread the message of Jesus Christ across the world, wrote much of the New Testament, and helped shape the faith of countless generations. Paul had his own plan, but God's plan was greater, and it could not be stopped. Over and over again, history has shown that when God has determined something, nothing can stand in its way. Nations have risen and fallen. Kings have come and gone. Yet his purpose remains firm. The world has seen times of war, times of peace, times of prosperity, and times of suffering. But through it all, God's will continues to unfold exactly as he intended. And it's not just in the stories of the Bible. Even in our own lives, we can see how God's hand moves in ways we may not understand at first. Sometimes we make plans thinking we know what's best, only to see doors close unexpectedly. We may feel frustrated, discouraged, or even abandoned when things don't go the way we imagine. But later, we often realize that those closed doors were actually part of God's greater purpose. The job we didn't get, the relationship that didn't work out, the path we thought was right but wasn't. These are all moments where God was redirecting us towards something better. When we trust in God's plan, we don't have to fear the obstacles in front of us. We don't have to be afraid of what the future holds because we know that He is in control. The world may change, people may fail us, circumstances may seem impossible, but God's plan remains. His promises are sure. His power is unmatched. His will cannot be shaken. No matter what you are facing today, no matter how big the challenge may seem, know this: if God has set something in motion, nothing can stop it. If He has called you to something, He will make a way. If He has promised to be with you, He will never leave your side. There is no force strong enough, no enemy powerful enough, no situation difficult enough to overturn what God has already determined. His plan is unstoppable. No matter how hard we strive, no matter how much we plan, human effort has its limits. We live in a world that glorifies ambition, hard work, and determination. And while these things have value, they are not enough on their own. People chase success, wealth, power, and influence, believing that if they work hard enough, they can control their destiny. But the truth is, no matter how much effort a person puts in, there are forces beyond human control that ultimately determine the outcome. History is full of examples of people who thought they could build something indestructible with their own strength, only to see it crumble. The Tower of Babel is a perfect illustration. The people of that time decided they would build a tower so high it would reach heaven itself. They believed in their intelligence, their unity, and their ability to control their own fate. But God saw their pride, and with a single act, confusing their languages, He brought their plans to nothing. They were scattered, their great ambition was halted, and they learned that human effort alone is never enough when it stands in opposition to God's will. Throughout history, kings and rulers have believed they could establish kingdoms that would last forever. The Roman Empire, the most powerful force in the world at its peak, controlled vast territories, had unmatched military strength, and seemed invincible. But where is it now? What happened to its glory? Despite all its power and influence, it could not stand the test of time. Every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually fades because human strength has limits. Even in our daily lives, we see how little control we truly have. A person can spend years building a career, only to lose everything overnight. A business can be thriving one moment and bankrupt the next. People can spend a lifetime trying to secure their future, but all it takes is one unexpected turn, a financial collapse, a health crisis, a natural disaster, to reveal how fragile human plans really are. No matter how much we prepare, we can never account for everything. This doesn't mean that hard work is meaningless. It is good to be diligent, to make wise choices, to do our best in everything we set out to do. But the key is understanding that our effort alone is not enough. Without God's guidance, without His blessing, without His divine intervention, all our striving is in vain. The Bible says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Though this means that no matter how much effort we put into something, if God is not in it, it will not stand. There are people who spend their whole lives chasing after things that ultimately don't satisfy. They work tirelessly to gain wealth, but no amount of money can buy peace. They seek recognition and success, but even the greatest achievements leave them feeling empty. Some reach the pinnacle of their careers only to realize they are still unfulfilled. Others strive to secure their future, but they cannot predict what tomorrow will bring. Others retire. Human effort alone can take a person far, but it can never take them beyond the limits of this world. One of the most dangerous lies people believe is that they don't need God, that they can handle life on their own. Many live as though they are in control, as if their plans and ambitions are the final word. But eventually, life has a way of reminding us that we are not as strong as we think we are. When difficulties come, when illness strikes, when relationships break, when loss happens, people realize how powerless they truly are. It is in those moments that they begin to see the limits of human strength and the necessity of relying on something greater than themselves. True success, true fulfillment, true security do not come from human effort alone. They come from trusting in God's plan, from surrendering to His will, from acknowledging that He is the one who holds the future. When a person tries to do everything on their own, they carry burdens they were never meant to bear. But when they place their trust in God, they find peace, knowing that He is in control. At the end of the day, the difference between human effort and God's plan is like the difference between building a sandcastle and building on solid rock. The sandcastle may look impressive for a time, but when the waves come, it washes away. But when something is built on the foundation of God's will, it stands firm no matter what storms come. Human efforts are limited, but God's power is limitless. Recognizing this truth changes everything. Frees us from the endless striving, the constant anxiety, the fear of failure. Instead of trying to control everything, we learn to trust, to rest, and to walk in the certainty that God's plan is greater than anything we could accomplish on our own. When God has a plan for someone's life, the best thing they can do is surrender to it. Yet time and time again, people resist. They hold on to their own desires, their own way of thinking, their own understanding of how life should go. But resisting God's will never leads to peace. It only leads to struggle. The moment a person chooses to fight against what God is trying to do, they step into a battle they can never win. The Bible is filled with examples of people who resisted God's direction and suffered because of it. Take Jonah, for example. God called him to preach to the city of Nineveh, but he didn't want to go. He had his own ideas, his own judgments, and his own fears. Instead of obeying, he ran in the opposite direction. But what happened? A storm threatened to sink the ship he was on, and he was thrown into the sea and swallowed by a great fish. Jonah could have avoided that entire ordeal if he had simply trusted God from the start. His resistance led to unnecessary struggle, and only after he surrendered did he find peace and purpose. Then there's the story of Pharaoh. God sent Moses to deliver a message. Let my people go. But Pharaoh refused. He hardened his heart over and over again, even as plague after plague devastated Egypt. His pride and stubbornness led to suffering, not just for himself, but for his entire nation. Even after he finally let the Israelites go, he changed his mind and chased after them, leading to his army's destruction in the Red Sea. If Pharaoh had humbled himself and obeyed from the beginning, he could have avoided the devastation that came upon him and his people. This pattern isn't just found in the Bible, it's something that happens in life every single day. When people resist God's calling, when they refuse to walk in his ways, they end up facing unnecessary hardship. A person may know deep down that God is calling them to leave a destructive habit behind, but they keep holding on to it, thinking they can handle it. Instead of experiencing freedom, they struggle with guilt, pain, and brokenness. Someone else may feel God leading them in a new direction, but out of fear, they refuse to step out in faith. Instead of walking in the blessings God has prepared, they stay stuck in frustration, wondering why things aren't working out. Resisting God doesn't mean he gives up on a person, but it does mean they may have to go through storms that could have been avoided. God will often allow struggles to bring people to a place of surrender. Just like Jonah in the belly of the fish, many people find themselves in dark places, crying out to God, only to realize that if they had followed him from the start, they wouldn't be there in the first place. But even in those struggles, God's grace is still present. He doesn't abandon those who resist him. He patiently waits for them to turn back. There is no peace in fighting against the will of God. No matter how much a person tries to take control, they will never find true fulfillment outside of his plan. The world teaches people to chase their own dreams, to do whatever makes them happy, to trust in their own wisdom. But the Bible says there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to destruction. People think they know what's best for their lives, but when they go against what God is leading them to do, they only find more struggle, more disappointment, and more emptiness. Surrender is the only way to peace. When a person stops resisting and starts trusting, everything changes. It doesn't mean life becomes easy, but it does mean they no longer have to fight battles they were never meant to fight. When someone submits to God's will, they step into the flow of his purpose, and things that once seemed impossible begin to fall into place. Doors open, burdens lift, and the weight of striving disappears. God's plan is always better than anything a person could come up with on their own. Fighting against it only delays the blessings he wants to pour out. Struggles will come in life no matter what, but there is a difference between the struggles that come from following God and the struggles that come from resisting him. One leads to growth and purpose. The choice is always there. Keep resisting and struggling, or surrender and walk in the fullness of what God has prepared. God's plan is not only powerful, but also redemptive and transformative. No matter how broken a person's life may seem, no matter how many mistakes they have made, no matter how far they have strayed, God has the ability to redeem, restore, and completely transform the life. What the world sees as ruined, he sees as redeemable. What people give up on, he calls back to purpose. There are countless stories of redemption throughout the Bible. One of the most striking examples is the life of Joseph. He was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery. He was falsely accused and imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped. By human standards, his life should have been over, but God had a greater plan. In a single moment, he lifted Joseph from the prison and placed him in the palace. The same man who was rejected and abandoned became second in command over all of Egypt. When his brothers stood before him trembling with fear, Joseph did not seek revenge. Instead, he spoke the powerful truth that defines God's redemptive nature. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What others intended for harm, God used to bring transformation, not just for Joseph, but for an entire nation. Then there's the story of Rahab. She was a woman with a past, known for her sinful lifestyle. By the world's standards, she had no future, no hope for redemption. But when she chose to align herself with God's people, He changed everything. Not only was she spared when Jericho fell, but she became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. God took someone society had written off and wove her into His divine plan. The greatest example of redemption and transformation is seen in the life of the Apostle Paul. He was once known as Saul, a man who persecuted Christians, hunting them down and approving their deaths. He was feared and hated by believers. Yet in one encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, everything changed. The man who once destroyed the church became the one who built it. The enemy of the gospel became its greatest preacher. Paul's life is proof that no one is beyond the reach of God's redeeming power. It doesn't matter how dark a person's past is. When God steps in, He brings new life. God's plan does not just rescue, it transforms. When He redeems a person, He doesn't leave them the same. He takes what was broken and makes it whole. He takes what was lost and gives it new direction. The world tries to fix problems on the surface, but God goes deeper. He doesn't just repair, He completely renews. Think about the way gold is refined. It goes through intense fire, but the fire is not meant to destroy it. It is meant to purify it. In the same way, God uses even the hardships of life to refine and transform His people. What the enemy meant for destruction, God uses for glory. The struggles, the trials, the pain, all of it can be part of God's plan to shape a person into who He created them to be. There are people who believe their past is too broken, their mistakes too great, their failures too final. But that is not how God sees them. He sees potential. He sees purpose. He sees what they can become through His grace. No life is beyond His ability to restore. No situation is beyond His power to change. The world offers second chances with limits, but God offers a complete transformation. He does not just patch up the past, He makes all things new. He doesn't just forgive, He gives a new identity. When someone surrenders to His plan, they are no longer defined by who they were, but by who He calls them to be. God's plan is not just about saving, it is about transforming. He doesn't just bring people out of darkness, He fills them with His light. He doesn't just pull them out of the pit, He sets them on a firm foundation. He doesn't just wipe away the past, He writes a brand new future. There is no limit to what He can do with a surrendered heart. Trust and surrender are the keys to walking in God's perfect plan. Many people struggle through life trying to control every detail, holding on tightly to their own plans and ideas. They rely on their own understanding, thinking that if they work hard enough or plan well enough, they can guarantee their future. But no amount of effort, no level of human wisdom can compare to the perfect knowledge and power of God. Trusting Him and surrendering to His will are the only ways to find true peace and purpose. From the beginning of time, God has been calling people to trust Him. Abraham was told to leave his homeland and go to a place he had never seen. He had no map, no guarantees, no proof of what lay ahead, only a promise from God. If he had refused to trust and surrender, he would have missed out on the blessings God had prepared. But because he chose to step out in faith, he became the father of many nations. His story is a reminder that God's greatest blessings come when people are willing to let go of their own understanding and follow Him completely. One of the biggest obstacles to surrender is fear. People hesitate to trust God because they're afraid of what they might lose. They fear losing control, losing comfort, or stepping into the unknown. But the truth is, trying to control everything only leads to more stress and anxiety. When people refuse to surrender, they carry burdens they were never meant to bear. They try to solve problems on their own, make decisions without seeking God's guidance, and push forward in their own strength. But life has a way of proving just how little control anyone really has. Plans fall apart, circumstances change, and unexpected trials come. Those who try to hold everything together on their own eventually reach a point of exhaustion. Jesus gave a simple but powerful invitation. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That rest only comes when a person is willing to trust Him completely. Surrender is not about giving up. It is about handing things over to the one who can handle them far better than we ever could. It is about recognizing that God sees what we cannot see, knows what we do not know, and has a plan that is far greater than anything we could create for ourselves. Peter experienced this firsthand when Jesus called him to walk on water. As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to do the impossible. But the moment he focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. That is what happens when people stop trusting God and start relying on their own strength. Fear creeps in, doubts take over, and they begin to fall. But even then, Jesus is always there to lift them up again. Trust is what keeps people standing. Surrender is what keeps them moving forward. There are countless stories of people who thought they knew what was best, only to later realize that God's way was far better. Sometimes what looks like a disappointment is actually God's protection. What seems like a setback is often a setup for something greater. But people only see this when they choose to trust. Surrender does not always mean understanding everything in the moment. It means believing that even when things don't make sense, God is still in control. Trusting God does not mean life will be free of challenges. Even Jesus faced trials, rejection, and suffering. But He showed the ultimate example of surrender when He prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done." That prayer changed everything. It was in His surrender that salvation was made possible for the whole world. That is the power of trusting God's plan. What looks difficult, what feels painful, what seems uncertain is often the very thing that leads to the greatest victories. People spend so much time worrying about the future, trying to figure out every detail, trying to make sure nothing goes wrong. But peace does not come from having everything figured out. It comes from knowing that God already has it figured out. Surrendering to Him does not mean losing. It means gaining something far greater. It means trading fear for faith, stress for peace, and uncertainty for divine assurance. There is no safer place to be than in the center of God's will. There is no greater freedom than knowing that He is in control. Those who trust and surrender will see His hand move in ways they never imagined. They will experience His faithfulness, His provision, and His power. The more a person lets go of their own way, the more they make room for God to work. And when God is at work, miracles happen, doors open, and lives are transformed. Trust and surrender are not just optional, they are the keys to everything God has in store.